There is a pattern that appears so consistently in the behavior of people managing concealment that once you learn to recognize it, you will find it difficult to stop seeing. It is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives in the texture of ordinary conversation as something that initially reads as helpfulness, as thoroughness, as the natural impulse of someone who wants to be understood correctly. A person is asked a straightforward question and they answer it, and then they keep going. They add context that wasn't requested. They explain the reasoning behind their actions in more detail than the question required. They anticipate objections that haven't been raised and address them preemptively. They qualify, and then qualify the qualification. They build in real time an architecture of explanation that is structurally far larger than the question that supposedly generated it. This is over-explanation, and it is one of the most reliable behavioral indicators available, not because it proves guilt in any specific instance, but because it reveals the psychological state that generates it. A person who is experiencing their own account as insufficient, and who is attempting to compensate for that insufficiency through volume. The innocent person, asked a question they have no investment in managing, answers it. The answer is proportional to the question. It contains what the question called for and stops when that has been delivered. The person is not monitoring their answer for defensibility, because defensibility is not a concern their psychological state is organized around. They have nothing to protect, so the answer requires no protection. The person with something to conceal is in a categorically different psychological situation. Their answer is not just an answer, it is a position that must be maintained. A version of events that must be made credible, a surface that must hold under scrutiny that may or may not come. And because they are experiencing their account from the inside, from the vantage point of someone who knows the distance between what they're saying and what is true, that account never feels as solid as it needs to feel. The gap between the presented version and the actual version creates a continuous background signal of insufficiency, and the most instinctive response to that signal is to add more detail, more context, more explanation, more of whatever seems like it might close the gap between what is being said and what needs to be believed. The psychological mechanism underneath over-explanation is one that behavioral researchers call justification anxiety, the specific discomfort produced by the felt need to make one's account credible to an external audience when the internal experience of that account is one of instability. Justification anxiety is distinct from ordinary social anxiety in a specific and important way. It is not about the interaction itself, or about the person's general comfort in social situations, or about their baseline threat calibration. It is specifically and exclusively about the account. It is generated not by the presence of the interrogator or the difficulty of the situation, but by the person's own awareness of the gap between what they are saying and what is true. This distinction matters enormously for accurate behavioral reading, because it means that over-explanation as a behavioral signal is not produced by anxious people. It is produced by people who are anxious about a specific thing. A person who is generally socially anxious may speak at length, qualify extensively, and add unrequested detail as a baseline social behavior that has nothing to do with concealment. A person who is concealing something specific will produce over-explanation specifically in response to questions that approach the concealed territory, and will produce proportional, natural responses to questions that don't. The map of where the over-explanation appears tells you more than the over-explanation itself. It is a behavioral heat map of the person's psychological investment, and the areas of highest temperature are the areas where the concealment architecture is working hardest. Innocent people, when accused or questioned about something they didn't do, produce a behavioral profile that is consistently misread in both directions. Popular intuition holds that innocence looks like calm, that the person who has nothing to hide will be relaxed, cooperative, and proportional in their responses. This is sometimes true and often not, because innocence does not protect against the anxiety of being suspected. Being accused of something you didn't do produces genuine emotional distress, indignation, confusion, the specific quality of disorientation that comes from being evaluated for something that is not part of your actual experience. This distress produces behavioral outputs that can superficially resemble the outputs of guilt, elevated stress responses, some increase in elaboration as the person attempts to establish their innocence, vocal and postural changes driven by genuine emotional activation. What distinguishes the innocent person's elaboration from the guilty person's over-explanation is its emotional source and its structural character. The innocent person elaborates from indignation rather than from anxiety. They are adding detail because they want the truth to be known, not because they are trying to make a constructed account more credible. Their elaboration tends to be emotionally congruent with the content. The distress of being wrongly accused is visible in the body and voice, and matches the content of what they're saying, rather than existing as a separate management process running alongside a carefully constructed narrative. And their elaboration follows the logic of genuine memory rather than the logic of strategic construction. It includes peripheral detaility of recounted experience, rather than the linear, resolved, suspiciously coherent structure of an account that has been built rather than recalled, rather than recalled, rather than recalled, rather on re rather on ri on ra on rad on ra 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 ma saka ga ga gonna da ka 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 ga sa ga 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 ma wait The innocent person also tends to produce what researchers call the repetition of spontaneous denial. They return to the denial without being prompted, because the denial is connected to a genuine emotional state that continues to generate the impulse to express it. Guilty people, by contrast, often produce a single denial and then move immediately to explanation because the denial is not connected to an ongoing emotional state of genuine outrage. It is a strategic move that has served its purpose and from which the account must now be constructed. The behavioral arc of guilt tends from denial toward explanation. The behavioral arc of innocence tends toward denial and returns to it repeatedly, because the indignation that generates it keeps regenerating. There is a specific subpattern within over-explanation that interrogators call the unsolicited alibi, the introduction of exculpatory information that has not been requested. It's at a point in the conversation where nothing has been specifically alleged. The unsolicited alibi is among the most diagnostically significant behavioral outputs in the concealment profile because it reveals that the person's psychological state is organized around a threat that has not yet been introduced into the conversation. They are defending against an accusation that hasn't been made. And the specific nature of the defense, its content, its timeline, its level of detail reveals the specific nature of the threat they are organized around. When someone tells you where they were, what they were doing, and who can confirm it, in response to a question that contained no implication of suspicion about any of those things, they have revealed the shape of what they are managing. It's not necessarily through the specific content of the alibi, which may be true, but through the fact that the alibi was produced at all. The psychological system that generates unsolicited exculpatory information is a system that has assessed the situation as threatening in a specific domain and produced a preemptive defense. Preemptive defenses require a threat model, and the threat model is almost always organized around the thing being concealed. The relationship between explanation, volume, and credibility is one of the most counterintuitive dynamics in human communication, and it operates against the instinct of almost everyone attempting to manage a difficult social situation. The instinct is that more explanation produces more credibility, that if the account is not being believed, adding more to it will close the gap. This instinct is wrong in a specific and consistent way. The credibility of an account is not a function of its volume but of its felt authenticity, and volume, past a certain threshold, actively undermines authenticity rather than supporting it. This happens because listeners, even those who are not formally trained in behavioral reading, have an intuitive model of what proportional communication looks like. Most people carry a felt sense, rarely articulated, but consistently operative, the natural ratio between a question and its answer. It's between an allegation and its response, between a social situation and the behavioral output it warrants. When an account significantly exceeds this felt ratio, the excess registers as signal, not always as conscious suspicion, but as a background sense of something that is slightly off, slightly too much, slightly more than the situation required. The over-explanation doesn't produce the belief it was trying to generate. It produces the mild, often unarticulated sense that something in the account required more support than a true account would have needed. Experienced interrogators use this dynamic deliberately. They allow the over-explanation to develop without interruption, not because they are being passive, but because the over-explanation is itself producing information. Every unrequested addition to the account is a window into the concealment architecture. It reveals what the person considers insufficiently supported, what they believe might not be believed, where the pressure in the account is concentrated. The explanation that was supposed to close the gap between the account and credibility instead maps the gap precisely, and the interrogator who can read that map has a structural understanding of the concealment that no direct questioning could have produced as efficiently. There is a version of over-explanation that is not about concealment in the conventional sense, but about identity management. The specific situation in which a person is not hiding a fact but protecting a self-concept. This variant is common enough and behaviorally similar enough to concealment-based over-explanation that it deserves direct examination, because conflating the two produces misreadings that lead to inaccurate assessments of people and situations. Identity protective over-explanation is generated not by the gap between a stated account and a true account of events, but by the gap between how the person is being perceived and how they need to be perceived in order to maintain a stable self-concept. The person is not hiding something that happened. They are managing something about who they are, a competence they need to be credited with, a value they need to be seen as holding, a version of their own character that the current situation is threatening to contradict. The over-explanation in this case is not constructing a false account of external events. It is defending an internal self-narrative against the threat of disconfirmation. The behavioral distinction between these two variants is subtle but readable. Concealment-based over-explanation tends to be focused on external facts, timelines, locations, actions, the specific content of what happened. Detective over-explanation tends to be focused on motivation and character, on why the person did what they did, what their intentions were, what kind of person they are. The concealment-based over-explicable is defending an account. Detective over-explicable is defending a self-concept. Both are producing more than the question required, but what they are producing more of, external fact versus internal characterization, reveals which psychological operation is driving the output. The practical application of this knowledge extends far beyond interrogation or deception detection contexts. In any situation where you are receiving an account of events, the proportionality of that account relative to the question that generated it is a reliable indicator of the psychological pressure the account is under, not proof, not certainty, tension, but a signal, one that warrants attention. that adjusts your probabilistic model of what is actually happening beneath the surface presentation, that tells you where to direct your observation next. What you are listening for is not any specific content, but a specific ratio. The ratio between what was asked and what was given. When that ratio is consistently exceeded, when the person is consistently giving you more than the question required, particularly in specific domains, while remaining proportional in others, you have a behavioral map of where the load is concentrated. The excess is not random, is generated by a specific psychological pressure in a specific location. In the location of the pressure, more than its intensity, tells you what you actually need to know. This is what the over-explanation reveals. In the end, not guilt in any simple or accusatory sense, but the presence of a gap. A gap between what is being presented and what is being experienced, between the account and the interior, between what the person needs you to believe and what they themselves know to be true. The gap generates the pressure. The pressure generates the volume, state, and the volume, read accurately, shows you exactly where the gap is and how large.